Hello and welcome to this video tutorial. My name is Melissa Huang and I'm your Information Literacy Librarian here at Western Colorado University. All one breath. Okay, so this video is going to be some general advice about world building. Of course, if you have questions about a specific topic or want some more depth into any of the things that I'm covering today, please feel free to contact me. In addition, related later, I do have a master's degree in classics, so I have 10 years of Latin and 6 years of Greek, so if you do need any language advice, please come talk to me. Alright, the way you can do that, of course, is by going to About and Contact Us on our beautiful library homepage, which is library.western.edu. Hopefully you already know how to navigate there, though, assuming that you've seen at least one other video from this channel. But today we're going to talk about first about types of sources, right? So the first things that you should ask about a source are who is it written by and who is it written for, right? So something like government documents can showcase sort of official bylines, declarations and things, but of course you should always take those with a grain of salt, right? So something like the CIA operations in the 60s and 70s, at the time, you would have sounded like a crazy person for making that kind of allegation, right? Of course, a lot of things come out later once most of the people involved are either dead or untouchable, right? So consider that when you're doing your research. How do you do research on government documents? That's a great question. So one of the things you can do is a books and media search and just look in the catalog for government documents. We are, as an institution, a federally licensed sort of library, so we're required to retain some documents here physically, but we also have access to online materials. So you can simply do a search for something like federal wildlife, just any old search. And then when you enter into this first section here, the catalog, if you're coming from off campus, I do recommend that you use this left panel, go to Format and eBook, so you're getting content that's going to be freely available online. So you'll notice right away that there's something wrong with this first link up here. The other ones you'll see Access Online, and when you click those, that just brings up usually a PDF or a site where you can find all of these documents. But this first one doesn't have an Access Online button, and that's something we're trying to resolve right now. But if you still wanted to see this, you can either click on this title and Google this. Usually if it says available online, it means it's somewhere that's searchable in general, that you don't have to be anyone special to get access to that. If you're just looking for a link, if you scroll down past the subjects, past all these things, and go to Staff View, this is kind of like the back end side. This is all machine readable coded information. But if you scroll down far enough, you will eventually see a link that you should be able to copy and paste, and sometimes this might be a download, it could be a zip file, things like that. So if you don't want to do that, I would say just, Google the title and make sure it's the one you're thinking of. Usually that means the title and the publication date at the very least. So hopefully that will get you where you need to go. That is the first way. The second way is if I go out of these searches back to our homepage and then mouse over Collections to Government Documents. So this page basically tells you about how, a little bit about what our responsibilities are as a depository library. And from here you can select different tabs in order to focus your search on different areas. So if we go to Federal, there are several different sort of searches and or databases to help you maybe narrow your search down. So if you're looking at agencies, you may need the code of that agency. That might get you better results. There's also MetaLib here, so you can look up general resources about something like crab or fish or wildlife or something. The Government Publication Office technically has a full record of everything published by the government. However, since the advent of the internet, it actually has not been as complete of a record, because what used to happen is that any government publication would be sent to the GPO first, which would then publish and store a record of that publication before disseminating it, right? But of course, with the internet, there are now many, many different agencies, and they don't always go through the GPO. So for older documents, the GPO will definitely be a great resource and really comprehensive in what it has. For current, not so much. Okay, so let's look up something like wildlife. And as it fetches all the results, you can choose to view retrieved here. All of these databases aren't really focused on usability, so you may have to poke around to get familiar with them. But as you do, you can really get into some really good stuff here. So that's another way to search for those. Okay. But let's say you're not interested in government documents. Let's say you're looking for an authentic sort of voice of a group that you aren't in and never have been a part of, right? So authentic groups, authentic voices come from in-groups and the way they speak to one another. This can sometimes be called code switching. So the way, a teen talks to another teen is very different from the way they talk to their professor, for example. Any ethnic group speaks differently to one another. Any hobby or career group has a shared vocabulary, and that's, I think, why conferences are so popular, right? People just like to get together with other people who know the language that they're talking, right? So in that sense, vocabulary is contextual, number one, and key, number two, to a good search. So finding those inroads to a hidden group is going to be located in their vocabulary, right? So if you consider a word like psychometry, in academic terms, it literally means a measure of psychology, like a questionnaire or ranking system. So if we were to do a search in books and media for psychometry, you're going to see measurement in psychology, statistics with confidence, because they're all referring to psychology, right? If you hang out with a lot of psychics, though, or paranormal people, it also can refer to the ability to gain information about an object by touching it. So, it can be very different, right? Words in a living language evolve and gain different connotations. So as an American, you'll never be able to use the verb to trump something casually ever again. Right, so even the name Karen now has different meanings than the original. I think it means pure, or it used to mean pure. So those are some considerations to start you off with the vocabulary. We're going to circle around back to that. But two things that people often overlook in worlds are geography and economy. So geography is the reason why the city-state evolved. So let's look up Greece here. So geography is the reason why you could have a democracy in Athens here and an oligarchy in Sparta down here, 100 miles away. Greek geography is extremely mountainous, and very little of the country has usable farmland, right? So instead, they turned to the sea, right? That's how they sort of developed economically, right? Sailing, fishing, pirating were all critical to their economic development, as was the taking of slaves. Part of the reason why Sparta fell was because of how they treated their helots, their slaves, and Athens thrived based on their process of being able to earn your freedom, right? That's obviously a gross oversimplification, but, that's what history boils down to, right? So, speaking of geography, one way to visit a place you have never been, and thanks to COVID you may never be able to visit, is to use Street View. So in Google Maps, if you look up a location, you can always drag this little guy down here in the right-hand corner out to a location that's marked in blue. So If you have never visited the Peloponnese, you can visit some of the country land here. Look at that. That's nice. If we go back out, maybe you want to go down to the coast and check out this beautiful sea, right? So you can zoom in by scrolling using your scroll wheel. You can move by double-clicking at a point and literally walk through, you know, a town, country, landscape you've never been before, right? So this is nice. I'm going to leave it here for a second. But the other thing you can do while collecting economic resources is sort of consider all your different sources, right? So, you know, consider what the banks are arguing they should be able to do to people. Check out what the lenders and lendees are saying, what kind of regulations the government has, tax information, the logistics of tax collection in your universe. I mean, our present world is, you know, incredibly diverse when it comes to regulation. You can sort of examine the microcosm of the Vietnamese street food vendors and why it still exists in a way that, you know, has almost all but disappeared anywhere else. So, you know, you oftentimes don't have to look too far for inspiration on that kind of thing. We live in a strange and wonderful world, right? Okay. So, speaking of that, my next topic is going to be the types of world building. Basically, for the purposes of research, you have worlds that are based in reality and worlds that are speculative, right? Fantasy worlds. But we aren't really here to talk about inspiration, you know. But language is a key component to solid world building and a source of inspiration. So we will be talking about it. The second thing I want to say first and foremost is that even speculative fiction should have rules to maintain internal consistency, right? People do notice when you mess that kind of thing up. So let's go back to our library homepage here. When we're talking about something like space, the vocabulary that people use is very important when you're considering what things to look up. So when you look up something like space exploration, you're going to get different results than if you were looking for terraforming. So let's look up terraforming, and let's go into our catalog results here. And our first two are actually the board game. Excellent board game. I do recommend it. But if we were to go back to format here and choose ebook, we can see the different kinds of, you know, speculation that people have written, but that are based in fact, right? The thing about this kind of research is, you know, don't try too hard, right? You're probably going to hear a lot about, you know, perfect is the enemy of the good, done is better than perfect, etc. So I won't belabor the point, but, you know, people didn't quit watching Star Wars because they showed sound in the vacuum of space, right? There are things that people will overlook for the enjoyment of the story, right? So, if we look, though, at another word that means the same thing as terraforming, which is ecopoiesis, which is very Greek, you'll get very different results, right? So this book, Evolution and Origin of the Universe, is like a speculation about the, you know, importance of design, creative, you know, design of the universe. So down here in the subjects, which I kind of glossed over before when we were looking in here earlier, there are different LC subjects, and this is basically Library of Congress subject headings. So this is a very fancy way of saying the sort of metadata categorizations that we librarians and catalogers who are specialized librarians ascribe to a book, right? So even though this title and this description may not have a word like cosmology in it, we put it on there so that anyone looking for this term will find this book, right? So this involves actually quite a lot of judgment. There's no real way to do this without bias, so bear that in mind. But one thing you can do is click on the term to get a list of documents, books, records that includes that term in it. So as you can see, as you start looking through here, you'll start to notice that cosmogony mostly refers to intelligent design. And if we close that out, cosmology is going to have more to do about the universe and cosmological constants in physics, right? So one tends to be used for a certain group of people and the other tends to be used for a different kind of person, right? So use those to your advantage, you know, whenever you can. Try and use the subjects that they're using when you're looking at one of these titles, for example. Check the descriptions, check details, use the words that they're using, right? So that's one way to get into an in-group, right? So the next note is that when you're borrowing from real cultures, you do, and you want them to be accurate, you want to check for the sources and who they're written by, right, and who they're written for example. It's not to say that only someone who grows up in a culture can write about that culture. Sometimes it's very important to collect sources that are from an outside perspective, right? But there is a difference, right, in the frame of reference that you have. So, you know, Asian comics are always joking about the kid who, you know, is just better than you in every way because of the kind of unique system and pressures that Asian parents put on their kids, and they often compare them to other children, right? So that's just like one weird thing that you just don't really get when you don't grow up in that way. But it's also important if you're reading something like a travel log or a travel blog and you are an American, it might be nice to view a different world like China through an American lens, right, with that frame of reference. Because there are just things that you don't really notice about a country that you grow up in, right? So something that I noticed in Italy when I went to Rome is how narrow the streets are in comparison to the US, right? And that's something that Italians wouldn't think of as narrower because to them the streets are the streets, right? For Americans, the streets are as wide as they are, right? You don't often think about things until you have something to compare them with, right? So, but it is important to be aware of who is writing and what they're writing, when they're writing, and who they're writing for, right? So, you know, especially when we get into historical research, which we'll talk about in another video, that can get really sticky, right? Okay. So that is going to be it for this video. We're going to talk about languages and historical research in other videos. So I will see you then.